Well, that was precious. The rest of you could have enjoyed being up here singing too, huh? Because that was beautiful. And who wrote that song? Let me see if it says on here somewhere. Let me think. Edward Partridge wrote that beautiful song. Joyous song. Let Zion in her beauty rise. We are honored today to be blessed with the presence and support of Elder Stephen Erastus Snow. Elder Snow was born in St. George, Utah on November 23, 1949. He married Phyllis Squire in June 1971. They are the parents of 4 sons. He earned his bachelor's degree in accounting at Utah State University and his law degree at Brigham Young University. Elder Snow was sustained as a General Authority 70 on March 31st, 2001. He served as a member of the presidency of the 70 from 2007 to 2012, when he supervised the Utah and North American Central areas. He served as Executive Director of the Priesthood and Family Department and as President of the Africa Southeast area of the Church. He is currently serving as church historian and recorder and is the executive director of the Church History Department. Prior to his call to serve as a full-time general authority of the church, Elder Snow was a senior partner in the Utah law firm of Snow and Nuffer. Nuffer, thank you. Elder Snow has been actively involved in supporting education, having served as a member and president of his local school board, chairman of the Utah State Board of Regents, and chairman of the Western States Commission of Higher Education. Previously, Elder Snow served as a full-time missionary in the North German Mission, as a bishop, a state president, president of the California San Fernando Mission from 94 to 97, and Area 70 in the 5th Quorum of the 70 for the Utah South area. We are so pleased to welcome him today to speak to us on the topic of the relationship between Amasa Mason Lyman and his son, Elder Francis Marian Lyman. Elder Snow. By the way, following Elder Snow's talk, the choir will sing, so reassemble and we'll sing O Songs of the Heart before the closing prayer by Gregory Lyman.
Thank you, David, and thanks to that choir. My, that was wonderful. It's really great to be here. I'm honored to have been invited and to enjoy your company. Grateful for those who keep the memory and legacy of this great family alive. So this is very worthwhile, and it's something that needs to be passed on to our younger generations. I see a few younger folks here, but we need more. And I'm grateful to you older folks who are attempting to do just that. I really enjoyed Richard's presentation. Thank you, Richard, for that description of Amasa and his early missionary efforts. I'm reminded of how much miracles influenced the missionary work in the early days of the church. We tend to think now of the Book of Mormon as being probably the most single important factor in the conversion of new converts. But then, probably because of literacy issues, miracles is really what brought people into the church. Book of Mormon, yes, certainly, but miracles occurred even 18 years later as the church began their first international proselyting efforts in Italy, and the case of Lorenzo Snow and the miracle that occurred there in the mountains of Italy, and even in Scandinavia amongst the early members of the church in Denmark. They had no Book of Mormon. It was not yet translated, but it was miracles. As the kind of which Richard has described is what brought early members into the church. So it's nice to be reminded of that again, Richard. Thank you. Really enjoyed that presentation. I don't descend from this family. My connection is, as I did my research, Richard has already described, the brother of my great-great-great-grandfather was the first missionary companion of Amasa, Zerubbabel Snow. Their parents had great imagination in naming their children. I come from Erastus, and Zerubbabel is a brother who later came west and was a judge in the Salt Lake City area for many years. So my wife's grateful that all she had to deal with was Erastus, which has been passed down to my son and my grandson, and not have to deal with Zerubbabel. That name is a mouthful. Well, I've learned a lot about Amasa Lyman in preparation for this event. Thank you. This reminds me of a story about President Sister Hinckley. She used to go with him many times for conferences, and they were in the Northeast, and were in a great hall with many stakes gathered, and President Hinckley asked Sister Hinckley to speak first. And as you know, she was very short in stature, and as she began to speak, the microphone was too high, and she couldn't be heard. And so President Hinckley came to the podium and adjusted it, just as David did with me, only the other direction. And as he went back to his seat, Sister Hinckley smiled and said, "That's why I bring him along." She had a great sense of humor. Well, I've learned a lot about your ancestor in preparation for this event. I learned about his impressive record of church service dating back to really his baptism in 1832. And most of you probably know that he risked his life and disguised himself during the Missouri conflict to discover what the non-Mormon plans were against the saints. And the time he was imprisoned in Richmond with the prophet Joseph, and how he served many missions. The challenge, as Richard has pointed out, in attempting to number the missions of these early leaders is difficult because it wasn't a set period of time as it is today. And so my researcher, Justin Bray, who I give a lot of credit to for the work I'm sharing with you today, counted 10 missions, but I could see he was off by apparently 8. And I found the same problem as I tried to count Erastus Snow's missions. He was somewhere around the same number, but it's really difficult. Some of these missions were like for a month or two. And so it's always a question about whether that's counted as a mission. But as Richard mentioned, he participated in the Zion's Camp expedition, which was really a very difficult undertaking. And he raised funds for the construction of the Nauvoo Temple. We know about his call to the Quorum of the 12 as the 13th apostle, his appointment as a counselor in the First Presidency, and his participation in the Council of 50. We know about his efforts to rein in the wayward saints that broke from the church to establish a colony in the Dakotas. He then captained several wagon companies to help bring the saints west. He sacrificed much in directing the church colonization's efforts in San Bernardino, California, presided over the European mission, and helped establish the city of Fillmore, where we're meeting today. As I drove down in my air-conditioned car and occasionally glanced at the temperature, I thought, wow, what it must have been like for Amasa and his family as they settled in the 1860s in this community. It must have been tough on days like this. We also know about his separation from the church later in his life. He was neither the first nor was he the last leader of the church to fall away. Amasa was a complex individual who was the subject of several books, dozens of articles, and even, as you know, a documentary film. And I thought about what could I add to this breadth of scholarship, especially in front of a gathering of his descendants. The tough thing about talking about church history in front of adoring descendants is you have to sometimes separate the myth from the fact. And there's nothing like adoring descendants to get you in trouble if you get some fact wrong. So please forgive me today. Many of my remarks today will be quotes from Marian's, Lyman's journal. Now that's a closed journal and is not open, and that's one of the advantages of being a church historian. You can access these things, and we're hopeful that eventually much, if not all of that journal will be made public. But one of the challenges in doing that is going through these extensive journals that some early leaders kept and redacting comments about, we're particularly sensitive about references to the temple ceremony, which were freely described in many early pioneer journals. So we're hopeful someday this journal might become public, but it's been, the First Presidency has turned down requests for that to be done at the present time. But we're working hard to get much out there that has not been open in the past. Well, I'd like to talk today about Amasa and his son, who preferred to be called Marian. He shared an exceptionally strong bond that was thoroughly tried and tested over the years. And many of those years, these tests and trials occurred right here in central Utah, right here in Fillmore. They harvested their crops and tended their fields together here in this community. They jointly managed a sawmill and shared the pulpit on more than one Sunday worship service. Amasa was Marian's role model and childhood hero, and Marian was Amasa's pride and joy. When Amasa was disfellowshipped and later excommunicated from the church, their bond was challenged like never before and nearly fractured, but it somehow endured. Today I'd like to review that, and during this turbulent time I'd like to talk about some of the references of particularly Marian's journal as this difficult time unfolded. I think there's important lessons we can all learn from this episode, not the least of which is the love of family and patience in the Lord's timing. Now, Amasa's separation from the church began when he delivered his now infamous sermon in Dundee, Scotland, in March of 1862, which downplayed the divinity of Jesus Christ, the need of a Savior, and the validity of the atonement. Shocking for one of the great witnesses of the restoration of the gospel. At the time it was given, it was actually published in the Millennial Star. And it wasn't until 5 years later, in January of 1867, that Amasa was called in to explain his views to the president of the church and the quorum of the 12 apostles. Despite issuing a public apology and repudiation of his teachings, Amasa continued to publicly share his unorthodox views of the atonement both in Beaver and in Fillmore. And when complaints went back and reached church headquarters in Salt Lake City, Brigham Young promptly called another meeting of the First Presidency and the 12. Amasa was disfellowshipped, removed from the 12, and had his priesthood withdrawn. As you can imagine, Amasa's son Marian was deeply saddened by his father's disfellowshipment from the church. He wrote, quote, "It seemed my heart was never before pierced with such sorrow and deep trouble. It cut me to the heart," and close quote. While Marian trembled for his father's sake, he kept hope that Amasa would ultimately regain his footing and find his way back to full church activity. He wrote again, "I hoped he would come around all right as long as he was not excommunicated from the church," close quote. Well, Amasa had not yet been excommunicated from the church. He found himself in a hostile environment here in Fillmore, as you can imagine. He had been a pillar of the church in this community and was a well-respected leader. His personal relationship with the prophet Joseph and his connection to the early restoration gained him influence, stature, and prestige in the eyes of his neighbors and fellow saints. Now, Amasa was disfellowshipped. Peers and neighbors monitored his actions suspiciously. While there is no record of Amasa's reaction to the church disciplinary action, he doesn't appear to have been combative or indignant. He quietly went about his business, kept his religious ideas to himself, and devoted more time to his family, his orchards, and sawmill. After his disciplinary council, many of his journal entries read, quote, "I spent the day on the sawmill," suggesting a turn away from his study of controversial topics and teachings. When Amasa was disfellowshipped, his son Marian found himself, as you can imagine, in an equally uncomfortable situation here in Fillmore. Some Latter-day Saints wondered how Marian could possibly reconcile his faith with his wayward father. Would he have to choose between family and church? Marian later wrote, quote, "I was now placed in a very awkward position, for all the saints would naturally look at me inquisitively, if not suspiciously, to know where I would